Chapter 8. Mr. Pumblechook's premises in the high street of the market town were of a peppercorny and farinaceous character, as the premises of a corn chandler and seedsman should be. It appeared to me that he must be a very happy man indeed to have so many little drawers in his shop, and I wondered when I peeped into one or two on the lower tiers and saw the tied-up brown paper packets inside, whether the flower seeds and bulbs ever wanted of a fine day to break out of those jails and bloom. It was in the early morning after my arrival that I entertained this speculation. On the previous night I had sent straight to bed in an attic with a sloping roof, which was so low in the corner where the bedstead was that I calculated the tiles as being within a foot of my eyebrows. In the same early morning I discovered a singular affinity between seeds and corduroys. Mr. Pumblechook wore corduroys, and so did his shopman, and somehow there was a general air and flavor about the corduroys, so much in the nature of seeds, and a general air and flavor about the seeds, so much in the nature of corduroys, that I hardly knew which was which. The same opportunity served me for noticing that Mr. Pumblechook appeared to conduct his business by looking across the street at the saddler, who appeared to transact his business by keeping his eye on the coachmaker, who appeared to get on in life by putting his hands in his pockets and contemplating the baker, who in his turn folded his arms and stared at the grocer, who stood at his door and yawned at the chemist. The watchmaker, always poring over a little desk with a magnifying glass at his eye, and always inspected by a group of smock frocks poring over him through the glass of his shop window, seemed to be about the only person in the high street whose trade engaged his attention. Mr. Pumblechook and I breakfasted at 8 o'clock in the parlor behind the shop, while the shopman took his mug of tea and hunch of bread and butter on a sack of peas in the front premises. I considered Mr. Pumblechook wretched company, besides being possessed by my sister's idea that a mortifying and penitential character ought to be imparted to my diet, besides giving me as much crumb as possible in combination with as little butter, and putting such a quantity of warm water into my milk that it would have been more candid to have left the milk out altogether. His conversation consisted of nothing but arithmetic. On my politely bidding him good morning, he said pompously, 7 times 9, boy. And how should I be able to answer, dodged in that way, in a strange place, on an empty stomach? I was hungry, but before I had swallowed a morsel, he began a running sum that lasted all through the breakfast. 7, and 4, and 8, and 6, and 2, and 10, and so on. And after each figure was disposed of, it was as much as I could do to get a bite or a sup before the next came, while he sat at his ease, guessing nothing, and eating bacon and hot roll in, if I may be allowed the expression, a gorging and gormandizing manner. For such reasons, I was very glad when 10 o'clock came, and we started for Miss Havisham's, though I was not at all at my ease regarding the manner in which I should acquit myself under that lady's roof. Within a quarter of an hour we came to Miss Havisham's house, which was of old brick and dismal, and had a great many iron bars to it. Some of the windows had been walled up. Of those that remained, all the lower were rustily barred. There was a courtyard in front, and that was barred, so we had to wait, after ringing the bell, until someone should come to open it. While we waited at the gate, I peeped in. Even then Mr. Pumblechook said, "And 14?" But I pretended not to hear him, and saw that at the side of the house there was a large brewery. No brewing was going on in it, and none seemed to have gone on for a long, long time. A window was raised, and a clear voice demanded, "What name?" To which my conductor replied, "Pumblechook." The voice returned, "Quite right," and the window was shut again, and a young lady came across the courtyard with keys in her hand. "This," said Mr. Pumblechook, "is Pip." "This is Pip, is it?" returned the young lady, who was very pretty and seemed very proud. "Come in, Pip." Mr. Pumblechook was coming in also when she stopped him with the gate. "Oh," she said, "did you wish to see Miss Havisham?" "If Miss Havisham wished to see me," returned Mr. Pumblechook, discomfited. "Ah," said the girl, "but you see she don't." She said it so finally and in such an undiscussable way that Mr. Pumblechook, though in a condition of ruffled dignity, could not protest. But he eyed me severely, as if I had done anything to him, and departed with the words reproachfully delivered, "Boy, let your behavior here be a credit unto them which brought you up by hand." I was not free from apprehension that he would come back to propound through the gate, "And 16?" But he didn't. My young conductress locked the gate, and we went across the courtyard. It was paved and clean, but grass was growing in every crevice. The brewery buildings had a little lane of communication with it, and the wooden gates of that lane stood open, and all the brewery beyond stood open, away to the high enclosing wall, and all was empty and disused. The cold wind seemed to blow colder there than outside the gate, and it made a shrill noise in howling in and out at the open sides of the brewery, like the noise of wind in the rigging of a ship at sea. She saw me looking at it, and she said, "You could drink without hurt all the strong beer that's brewed there now, boy." "I should think I could, miss," said I in a shy way. "Better not try to brew beer there now, or it would turn out sour, boy, don't you think so?" "It looks like it, miss." "Not that anybody means to try," she added, "for that's all done with, and the place will stand as idle as it is till it falls. As to strong beer, there's enough of it in the cellars already to drown the manor house." "Is that the name of this house, miss?" "One of its names, boy." "It has more than one, then, miss?" "One more. Its other name was Satis, which is Greek, or Latin, or Hebrew, or all three, or all one to me, for enough." "Enough House," said I. "That's a curious name, miss." "Yes," she replied, "but it meant more than it said. It meant, when it was given, that whoever had this house could want nothing else. They must have been easily satisfied in those days, I should think. But don't loiter, boy." Though she called me boy so often, and with a carelessness that was far from complimentary, she was of about my own age. She seemed much older than I, of course, being a girl, and beautiful and self-possessed, and she was as scornful of me as if she had been 21 and a queen. We went into the house by a side door. The great front entrance had 2 chains across it outside, and the first thing I noticed was that the passages were all dark, and that she had left a candle burning there. She took it up, and we went through more passages and up a staircase, and still it was all dark, and only the candle lighted us. At last we came to the door of a room, and she said, "Go in." I answered more in shyness than politeness, "After you, miss." To this she returned, "Don't be ridiculous, boy. I'm not going in," and scornfully walked away, and, what was worse, took the candle with her. This was very uncomfortable, and I was half afraid. However, the only thing to be done being to knock at the door, I knocked, and was told from within to enter. I entered, therefore, and found myself in a pretty large room, well lighted with wax candles. No glimpse of daylight was to be seen in it. It was a dressing-room, as I supposed from the furniture, though much of it was of forms and uses then quite unknown to me. But prominent in it was a draped table with a gilded looking-glass, and that I made out at first sight to be a fine lady's dressing-table. Whether I should have made out this object so soon if there had been no fine ladies sitting at it, I cannot say. In an armchair, with an elbow resting on the table and her head leaning on that hand, sat the strangest lady I have ever seen, or shall ever see. She was dressed in rich materials, satins and laces and silks, all of white. Her shoes were white, and she had a long white veil dependent from her hair, and she had bridal flowers in her hair, but her hair was white. Some bright jewels sparkled on her neck and on her hands, and some other jewels lay sparkling on the table. Dresses, less splendid than the dress she wore, and half-packed trunks were scattered about. She had not quite finished dressing, for she had but one shoe on. The other was on the table near her hand. Her veil was but half arranged. Her watch and chain were not put on, and some lace for her bosom lay with those trinkets, and with her handkerchief and gloves, and some flowers, and a prayer book all confusedly heaped about the looking-glass. It was not in the first few moments that I saw all these things, though I saw more of them in the first moments than might be supposed. But I saw that everything within my view which ought to be white had been white long ago, and had lost its luster, and was faded and yellow. I saw that the bride within the bridal dress had withered like the dress, and like the flowers, and had no brightness left but the brightness of her sunken eyes. I saw that the dress had been put upon the rounded figure of a young woman, and that the figure upon which it now hung loose had shrunk to skin and bone. Once I had been taken to see some ghastly waxwork at the fair, representing I know not what impossible personage lying in state. Once I had been taken to one of our old marsh churches to see a skeleton in the ashes of a rich dress that had been dug out of a vault under the church pavement. Now waxwork and skeleton seemed to have dark eyes that moved and looked at me. I should have cried out if I could. "Who is it?" said the lady at the table. "Pip, ma'am. Pip. Mr. Pumblechook's boy, ma'am. Come to play. Come nearer. Let me look at you. Come close." It was when I stood before her, avoiding her eyes, that I took note of the surrounding objects in detail, and saw that her watch had stopped at 20 minutes to 9, and that a clock in the room had stopped at 20 minutes to 9. "Look at me," said Miss Havisham. "You are not afraid of a woman who has never seen the sun since you were born?" I regret to state that I was not afraid of telling the enormous lie comprehended in the answer, "No." "Do you know what I touch here?" she said, laying her hands one upon the other on her left side. "Yes, ma'am." It made me think of the young man. "What do I touch?" "Your heart." "Broken." She uttered the word with an eager look, and with strong emphasis, and with a weird smile that had a kind of boast in it. Afterwards she kept her hands there for a little while, and she slowly took them away as if they were heavy. "I'm tired," said Miss Havisham. "I want diversion, and I have done with men and women. Play." I think it will be conceded by my most disputatious reader that she could hardly have directed an unfortunate boy to do anything in the wide world more difficult to be done under the circumstances. "I sometimes have sick fancies," she went on, "and I have a sick fancy that I want to see some play. There, there," with an impatient movement of the fingers of her right hand. "Play, play, play." For a moment, with the fear of my sisters working me before my eyes, I had a desperate idea of starting round the room in the assumed character of Mr. Pumblechook's chaise cart. But I felt myself so unequal to the performance that I gave it up, and stood looking at Miss Havisham in what I suppose she took for a dogged manner, inasmuch as she said, when we had taken a good look at each other, "Are you sullen and obstinate?" "No, ma'am, I'm very sorry for you, and very sorry I can't play just now. If you complain of me, I shall get into trouble with my sister, so I would do it if I could, but it's so new here, and so strange, and so fine, and melancholy." I stopped, fearing I might say too much, or had already said it, and we took another look at each other. Before she spoke again, she turned her eyes from me, and looked at the dress she wore, and at the dressing-table, and finally at herself in the looking-glass. "So new to him," she muttered. "So old to me. So strange to him. So familiar to me. So melancholy to both of us. Cara Stella." As she was still looking at the reflection of herself, I thought she was still talking to herself, and kept quiet. Call Estella, she repeated, flashing a look at me. You can do that. Call Estella. At the door. To stand in the dark in a mysterious passage of an unknown house, bawling Estella to a scornful young lady, neither visible nor responsive, and feeling at a dreadful liberty so to roar out her name, was almost as bad as playing to order. But she answered at last, and her light came along the dark passage like a star. Miss Havisham beckoned her to come close, and took up a jewel from the table, and tried its effect upon her fair young bosom and against her pretty brown hair. Your own one day, my dear, and you will use it well. Let me see you play cards with this boy. With this boy? He is a common laboring boy. I thought I overheard Miss Havisham answer, only it seemed so unlikely. Well, you can break his heart. What do you play, boy? Asked Estella of myself, with the greatest disdain. Nothing but beggar my neighbor, miss. Beggar him, said Miss Havisham to Estella. So we sat down to cards. It was then I began to understand that everything in the room had stopped, like the watch and the clock, a long time ago. I noticed that Miss Havisham put down the jewel exactly on the spot from which she had taken it up. As Estella dealt the cards, I glanced at the dressing table again, and saw that the shoe upon it, once white, now yellow, had never been worn. I glanced down at the foot from which the shoe was absent, and saw that the silk stocking on it, once white, now yellow, had been trodden ragged. Without this arrest of everything, the standing still of all the pale, decayed objects, not even the withered bridal dress and the collapsed form could have looked so like grave clothes, or the long veil so like a shroud. So she sat, corpse-like, as we played at cards, the frillings and trimmings on her bridal dress looking like earthly paper. I knew nothing then of the discoveries that are occasionally made of bodies buried in ancient times, which fall to powder in the moment of being distinctly seen. But I have often thought since that she must have looked as if the admission of the natural light of day would have struck her to dust. He calls the knaves jacks, this boy, said Estella with disdain, before our first game was out. And what coarse hands he has, and what thick boots! I had never thought of being ashamed of my hands before, but I began to consider them a very indifferent pair. Her contempt for me was so strong that it became infectious, and I caught it. She won the game, and I dealt. I misdealt, as was only natural when I knew she was lying in wait for me to do wrong, and she denounced me for a stupid, clumsy, laboring boy. You say nothing of her, remarked Miss Havisham to me as she looked on. She says many hard things of you, but you say nothing of her. What do you think of her? I don't like to say, I stammered. Tell me in my ear, said Miss Havisham, bending down. I think she's very proud, I replied in a whisper. Anything else? I think she's very pretty. Anything else? I think she's very insulting. She was looking at me then with a look of supreme aversion. Anything else? I think I should like to go home and never see her again, though she is so pretty. I'm not sure that I shouldn't like to see her again, but I should like to go home now. You shall go soon, said Miss Havisham aloud. Play the game out. Saving for the one weird smile at first, I should have felt almost sure that Miss Havisham's face could not smile. It had dropped into a watchful and brooding expression, most likely when all the things about her had become transfixed, and it looked as if nothing could ever lift it up again. Her chest had dropped so that she stooped, and her voice had dropped so that she spoke low, and with a dead lull upon her altogether, she had the appearance of having dropped body and soul, within and without, under the weight of a crushing blow. I played the game to an end with Estella, and she beggared me. She threw the cards down on the table when she had won them all, as if she despised them for having been won of me. "When shall I have you here again?" said Miss Havisham. "Let me think." I was beginning to remind her that today was Wednesday, when she checked me with her former impatient movement to the fingers of her right hand. "There, there. I know nothing of the days of the week. I know nothing of weeks of the year. Come again after 6 days. You hear?" "Yes, ma'am." "Estella, take him down. Let him have something to eat, and let him roam and look about while he eats. Go, Pip." I followed the candle down as I had followed the candle up, and she stood it in the place where we had found it, until she opened the side entrance. I had fancied, without thinking about it, that it must necessarily be night time. The rush of the daylight quite confounded me, had made me feel as if I had been in the candlelight of the strange room many hours. "You are to wait here, you boy," said Estella, and disappeared and closed the door. I took the opportunity of being alone in the courtyard to look at my coarse hands and my common boots. My opinion of those accessories was not favorable. They had never troubled me before, but they troubled me now as vulgar appendages. I determined to ask Joe why he had ever taught me to call those picture cards jacks, which ought to be called knaves. I wished Joe had been more rather genteelly brought up, and then I should have been so too. She came back with some bread and meat and a little mug of beer. She put the mug down on the stones of the yard and gave me the bread and meat without looking at me, as insolently as if I were a dog in disgrace. I was so humiliated, hurt, spurned, offended, angry, sorry. I cannot hit upon the right name for the smart. God knows what its name was, that tears started to my eyes. The moment they sprang there, the girl looked at me with a quick delight in having been the cause of them. This gave me power to keep them back and to look at her, so she gave a contemptuous toss, but with a sense, I thought, of having made too sure that I was so wounded, and left me. But when she was gone, I looked about me for a place to hide my face in, and got behind one of the gates in the brewery lane, and leaned my sleeve against the wall there, and leaned my forehead on it, and cried. As I cried, I kicked the wall and took a hard twist at my hair. So bitter were my feelings, and so sharp was the smart without a name that needed counteraction. My sister's bringing up had made me sensitive. In the little world in which children have their existence, whatsoever brings them up, there is nothing so finely perceived and so finely felt as injustice. It may be only small injustice that the child can be exposed to, but the child is small, and its world is small, and its rocking horse stands as many hands high, according to scale, as a big-boned Irish hunter. Within myself I had sustained from my babyhood a perpetual conflict with injustice. I had known, from the time when I could speak, that my sister, in her capricious and violent coercion, was unjust to me. I had cherished a profound conviction that her bringing me up by hand gave her no right to bring me up by jerks. Through all my punishments, disgraces, fasts, and vigils, and other penitential performances, I had nursed this assurance, and to my communing so much with it in a solitary and unprotected way, I, in great part, refer the fact that I was morally timid and very sensitive. I got rid of my injured feelings for the time by kicking them into the brewery wall and twisting them out of my hair, and then I smoothed my face with my sleeve and came from behind the gate. The bread and meat were acceptable, and the beer was warming and tingling, and I was soon in spirits to look about me. To be sure, it was a deserted place, down to the pigeon house and the brewery yard, which had been blown crooked on its pole by some high wind, and would have made the pigeons think themselves at sea if there had been any pigeons there to be rocked by it. But there were no pigeons in the dovecot, no horses in the stable, no pigs in the sty, no malt in the storehouse, no smells of grains and beer in the copper or the vat. All the uses and scents of the brewery might have evaporated with its last reek of smoke. In a by-yard there was a wilderness of empty casks, which had a certain sour remembrance of better days lingering about them. But it was too sour to be accepted as a sample of the beer that was gone, and in this respect I remember those recluses as being like most others. Behind the furthest end of the brewery was a rank garden with an old wall, not so high but that I could struggle up and hold on long enough to look over it, and see that the rank garden was the garden of a house, and that it was overgrown with tangled weeds, but that there was a track upon the green and yellow paths, as if someone sometimes walked there, and that Estella was walking away from me even then, but she seemed to be everywhere, for when I yielded to the temptation presented by the casks and began to walk on them, I saw her walking on them at the end of the yard of casks. She had her back towards me, and held her pretty brown hair spread out in her two hands, and never looked around, and passed out of my view directly. So in the brewery itself, by which I mean the large paved lofty place in which they used to make the beer, and where the brewing utensils still were, when I first went into it, and rather oppressed by its gloom, stood near the door looking about me, I saw her pass among the extinguished fires, and ascend some light iron stairs, and go out by a gallery high overhead, as if she were going out into the sky. It was in this place, and at this moment, that a strange thing happened to my fancy. I thought it a strange thing then, and I thought it a stranger thing long afterwards. I turned my eyes, a little dimmed by looking up at the frosty light, towards a great wooden beam in a low nook of the building near me on my right hand, and I saw a figure hanging there by the neck. A figure all in yellow white, with but one shoe to the feet, and it hung so that I could see that the faded trimmings of the dress were like earthy paper, and that the face was Miss Havisham's, with a movement going over the whole countenance as if she were trying to call to me. In the terror of seeing the figure, and in the terror of being certain that it had not been there a moment before, I at first ran from it, and then ran towards it, and my terror was the greatest of all when I found no figure there. Nothing less than the frosty light of the cheerful sky, the sight of people passing beyond the bars of the courtyard gate, and the reviving influence of the rest of the bread and meat and beer would have brought me round. Even with those aids, I might not have come to myself as soon as I did, but that I saw Stella approaching with the keys to let me out. She would have some fair reason for looking down upon me, I thought, if she saw me frightened, and she would have no fair reason. She gave me a triumphant glance in passing me, as if she rejoiced that my hands were so coarse and my boots were so thick, and she opened the gate and stood holding it. I was passing out without looking at her when she touched me with a taunting hand. "Why don't you cry?" "Because I don't want to." "You do," said she. "You have been crying till you're half blind, and you are near crying again now." She laughed contemptuously, pushed me out, and locked the gate upon me. I went straight to Mr. Pumblechook's, and was immensely relieved to find him not at home. So, leaving word with the shopman on what day I was wanted at Miss Havisham's again, I set off on the 4-mile walk to our forge, pondering as I went along on all I had seen, and deeply revolving that I was a common laboring boy, that my hands were coarse, that my boots were thick, that I had fallen into a despicable habit of calling knaves jacks, that I was much more ignorant than I had considered myself last night, and generally that I was in a low-lived bad way. Chapter 9. When I reached home, my sister was very curious to know all about Miss Havisham's, and asked a number of questions, and I soon found myself getting heavily bumped from behind in the nape of the neck and the small of the back, and having my face ignominiously shoved against the kitchen wall, because I did not answer those questions at sufficient length. If a dread of not being understood be hidden in the breasts of other young people to anything like the extent to which it used to be hidden in mine, which I consider probable, as I have no particular reason to suspect myself of having been a monstrosity, it is the key to many reservations. I felt convinced that if I described Miss Havisham's as my eyes had seen it, I should not be understood. Not only that, but I felt convinced that Miss Havisham, too, would not be understood, and although she was perfectly incomprehensible to me, I entertained an impression that there would be something coarse and treacherous in my dragging her as she really was, to say nothing of Mrs. Stella, before the contemplation of Mrs. Joe. Consequently, I said as little as I could, and had my face shoved against the kitchen wall. The worst of it was that the bullying old Pumblechook, preyed upon by a devouring curiosity to be informed of all I had seen and heard, came gaping over in his chaise cart at tea-time to have the details divulged to him, and the mere sight of the torment, with his fishy eyes and mouth open, his sandy hair inquisitively on end, and his waistcoat heaving with windy arithmetic, made me vicious in my reticence. "Well, boy," Uncle Pumblechook began, as soon as he was seated in the chair of honor by the fire, "how did you get out uptown?" I answered, "Pretty well, sir," and my sister shook her fist at me. "Pretty well," Mr. Pumblechook repeated. "Pretty well is no answer. Tell us what you mean by pretty well." My sister, with an exclamation of impatience, was going to fly at me. I had no shadow of defense, for Joe was busy in the forge. Mr. Pumblechook interposed with, "No, don't lose your temper. Leave this lad to me, ma'am. Leave this lad to me." Mr. Pumblechook then turned towards me, as if he were going to cut my hair, and said, "First, to get our thoughts in order, 43 pence." I calculated the consequences of replying £400, and finding them against me, went as near the answer as I could, which was somewhere about 8 pence off. And Mr. Pumblechook then put me through my pence table from 12 pence make 1 shilling, up to 40 pence make 3 and 4 pence, and then triumphantly demanded, as if he had done for me, "Now, how much is 43 pence?" To which I replied, after a long interval of reflection, "I don't know," and I was so aggravated that I almost doubt if I did know. Mr. Pumblechook worked his head like a screw to screw it out of me, and said, "Is 43 pence 7 and 6 pence 3 fardens, for instance?" "Yes," said I, and although my sister instantly boxed my ears, it was highly gratifying to me to see that the answer spoiled his joke, and brought him to a dead stop. "Boy, what like is Miss Havisham?" Mr. Pumblechook began again when he had recovered, folding his arms tight on his chest and applying the screw. "Very tall and dark," I told him. "Is she, uncle?" asked my sister. Mr. Pumblechook winked assent, from which I at once inferred that he had never seen Miss Havisham, for she was nothing of the kind. "Good," said Mr. Pumblechook conceitedly. "This is the way to have him. We are beginning to hold our own, I think, mum." "I'm sure, uncle," returned Mrs. Joe. "I wish you had him always. You know so well how to deal with him." "Now, boy, what was she a-doing of when you went in today?" asked Mr. Pumblechook. "She was sitting," I answered, "in a black velvet coach." Mr. Pumblechook and Mrs. Joe stared at one another, as they well might, and both repeated, "In a black velvet coach?" "Yes," said I, "and Mrs. Stella, that's her niece, I think, handed her in cake and wine at the coach window on a gold plate, and we all had cake and wine on gold plates, and I got up behind the coach to eat mine because she told me to." "Was anybody else there?" asked Mr. Pumblechook. "4 dogs," said I. "Large or small?" "Immense," said I, "and they fought for veal cutlets out of a silver basket." Mr. Pumblechook and Mrs. Joe stared at one another again, in utter amazement. I was perfectly frantic, a reckless witness under the torture, and would have told them anything. "Where was this coach, in the name of gracious?" asked my sister. "In Miss Havisham's room." They stared again. "But there weren't any horses to it," I added this saving clause in the moment of rejecting 4 richly caparisoned coursers, which I had had wild thoughts of harnessing. "Can this be possible, uncle?" said Mrs. Joe. "What can the boy mean?" "I'll tell you, Mum," said Mr. Pumblechook. "My opinion is it's a sedan chair. She's flighty, you know, very flighty. Quite flighty enough to pass her days in a sedan chair." "Did you ever see her in it, uncle?" asked Mrs. Joe. "How could I?" he returned, forced to the admission, "when I'd never seen her in my life. Never clapped eyes upon her." "Goodness, uncle! And yet you've spoken to her." "Why, don't you know," said Mr. Pumblechook testily, "that when I've been there I've been took up to the outside of her door, and the door has stood ajar, and she has spoke to me that way. Don't say you don't know that, Mum. However, the boy went there to play. What did you play at, boy?" "We played with flags," I said. I beg to observe that I think of myself with amazement when I recall the lies I told on this occasion. "Flags?" echoed my sister. "Yes," said I. Estella waved a blue flag, and I waved a red one, and Miss Havisham waved one sprinkled all over with little gold stars out at the coach window. And then we all waved our swords and hurrahed. "Swords?" repeated my sister. "Where did you get swords from?" "Out of a cupboard. And I saw pistols in it, and jam, and pills. And there was no daylight in the room, but it was all lighted up with candles." "That's true, Mum," said Mr. Pumblechook with a grave nod. "That's the state of the case, for that much I've seen myself." And then they both stared at me, and I, with an unobtrusive show of artlessness on my countenance, stared at them, and plaited the night leg of my trousers with my right hand. If they'd asked me any more questions, I should undoubtedly have betrayed myself, for I was even then on the point of mentioning that there was a balloon in the yard, and should have hazarded the statement but for my invention being divided between that phenomenon and a bear in the brewery. They were so much occupied, however, in discussing the marvels I had already presented for their consideration that I escaped. The subject still held them when Joe came in from his work to have a cup of tea, to whom my sister, more for the relief of her own mind than for the gratification of his, related my pretended experiences. Now, when I saw Joe open his blue eyes and roll them all round the kitchen in helpless amazement, I was overtaken by penitence, but only as regarded him, not in the least as regarded the other two. Towards Joe, and Joe only, I considered myself a young monster, while they sat debating what results would come to me from Miss Havisham's acquaintance and favor. They had no doubt that Miss Havisham would do something for me. Their doubts related to the form that something would take. My sister stood out for property. Mr. Pumblechook was in favor of a handsome premium for binding me apprentice to some genteel trade, say, the corn and seed trade, for instance. Joe fell into the deepest disgrace with both for offering the bright suggestion that I might only be presented with one of the dogs who had fought for the veal cutlets. "If a fool's head can't express better opinions than that," said my sister, "and you have got any work to do, you'd better go and do it." So we went. After Mr. Pumblechook had driven off, and when my sister was washing up, I stole into the forge to Joe and remained by him until he had done for the night. Then I said, "Before the fire goes out, Joe, I should like to tell you something." "Should you, Pip?" said Joe, drawing his shoeing stool near the forge. "Then tell us. What is it, Pip?" "Joe," said I, taking hold of his rolled-up shirt-sleeve and twisting it between my finger and thumb, "you remember all that about Miss Havisham's?" "Remember?" said Joe. "I believe you. Wonderful." "It's a terrible thing, Joe. It ain't true." "What are you telling of, Pip?" cried Joe, falling back in the greatest amazement. "You don't mean to say it's—" "Yes, I do. It's lies, Joe." "But not all of it. Why, sure you don't mean to say, Pip, that there was no black velvet coat?" For I stood shaking my head. "But at least there was dogs, Pip. Come, Pip, said Joe persuasively. If there weren't no real cutlets, at least there was dogs. No, Joe. A dog? Said Joe. A puppy? Come. No, Joe, there was nothing at all of the kind. As I fixed my eyes helplessly on Joe, Joe contemplated me in dismay. Pip, old chap, this won't do, old fellow, I say. What do you expect me to go to? It's terrible, Joe, ain't it? Terrible, cried Joe. Awful. What possessed you? I don't know what possessed me, Joe, I replied, letting his shirt sleeve go and sitting down in the ashes at his feet, hanging my head. But I wish you hadn't taught me to call knaves at cards jacks, and I wish my boots weren't so thick, nor my hands so coarse. And then I told Joe that I felt very miserable, and that I hadn't been able to explain myself to Mrs. Joe and Pumblechook, who were so rude to me, and that there had been a beautiful young lady at Miss Havisham's who was dreadfully proud, and that she had said I was common, and that I knew I was common, and that I wished I was not common, and that the lies had come of it somehow, though I didn't know how. This was a case of metaphysics, at least as difficult for Joe to deal with as for me. But Joe took the case altogether out of the region of metaphysics, and by that means vanquished it. There's one thing you may be sure of, Pip, said Joe after some rumination, namely that lies is lies. However they come, they did not come, and they come from the father of lies and work round to the same. Don't you tell no more of 'em, Pip. That ain't the way to get out of being common, old chap. And as to being common, I don't make it out at all clear. You are uncommon in some things. You're uncommon small. Likewise, you're an uncommon scholar. No, I'm as ignorant and backward, Joe. Why, see what a letter you wrote last night. Wrote in print, even. I've seen letters, and from gentlefolks, that I'll swear weren't wrote in print, said Joe. I have learnt next to nothing, Joe. You think much of me, it's only that. Well, Pip, said Joe, be it so or be it so'n't, you must be a common scholar. Afore you can be an uncommon one, I should hope. The king upon his throne with his crown upon his head can't sit and write his acts of parliament in print without having begun when he was an unpromoted prince with the alphabet. Ah, added Joe with a shake. And begun at A, too, and worked his way to Z. And I know what that is to do, though I can't say I've exactly done it. There was some hope in this piece of wisdom, and it rather encouraged me. Whether common ones, as to callings and earnings, pursued Joe reflectively, mind me the better of continuing for to keep company with common ones, instead of going out to play with uncommon ones. Which reminds me to hope that there were a flag, perhaps. No, Joe. I'm sorry there weren't a flag, Pip. Whether that might or mightn't be is a thing as can't be looked into now, without putting your sister on the rampage, and that's a thing not to be thought of as being done intentional. Look here, Pip, at what is said to you by a true friend, which this to you the true friends say, if you can't get to be uncommon through going straight, you'll never get it to do anything through getting crooked. So don't tell no more on 'em, and live well and die happy. You're not angry with me, Joe? No, old chap. But bearing in mind that them were which I mean or say of a stunning and audacious sort, alluding to them which bordered on veal cutlets and dog fighting, a sincere well-wisher would advise Pip that they're being dropped into your meditations when you go upstairs to bed. That's all, chap, and don't ever do it no more. When I got up to my little room and said my prayers, I did not forget Joe's recommendation, and yet my young mind was in that disturbed and unthankful state that I thought long after I laid me down how common Estella would consider Joe, a mere blacksmith, how thick his boots and how coarse his hands, I thought how Joe and my sister were then sitting in the kitchen, and how I had come up to bed from the kitchen, and how Miss Havisham and Estella never sat in a kitchen, but were far above the level of such things. I fell asleep recalling what I used to do when I was at Miss Havisham's, as though I had been there weeks or months instead of hours, and as though it were quite an old subject of remembrance, instead of one that had arisen only that day. That was a memorable day to me, for it made great changes in me. But it is the same with my life. Imagine one selected day struck out of it, and think how different its course would have been. Pause, you who read this, and think for a moment of the long chain of iron or gold, of thorns or flowers, that would never have bound you but for the formation of the first link on one memorable day. Chapter 10. The felicitous idea occurred to me a morning or two later when I woke that the best step I could take towards making myself uncommon was to get out of Biddy everything she knew. In pursuance of this luminous conception, I mentioned to Biddy, when I went to Mr. Wopsle's great aunt's at night, that I had a particular reason for wishing to get on in life, and that I should feel very much obliged to her if she would impart all her learning to me. Biddy, who was the most obliging of girls, immediately said she would, and indeed began to carry out her promise within 5 minutes. The educational scheme or course established by Mr. Wopsle's great aunt may be resolved into the following synopsis. The pupils ate apples and put straws down one another's backs until Mr. Wopsle's great aunt collected her energies and made an indiscriminate totter at them with a birch rod. After receiving the charge with every mark of derision, the pupils formed in line and buzzingly passed a ragged book from hand to hand. The book had an alphabet in it, some figures and tables, and a little spelling. That is to say, it had had once. As soon as this volume began to circulate, Mr. Wopsle's great aunt fell into a state of coma, arising either from sleep or rheumatic paroxysm. The pupils then entered among themselves upon a competitive examination on the subject of boots, with the view of ascertaining who could tread the hardest upon whose toes. This mental exercise lasted until Biddy made a rush at them and distributed 3 defaced Bibles, shaped as if they had been unskilfully cut off the clump end of something, more illegibly printed at the best than any curiosities literature I have since met with, speckled all over with iron mold, and having various specimens of the insect world smashed between their leaves. This part of the course was usually lightened by several single combats between Biddy and refractory students. When the fights were over, Biddy gave out the number of a page, and then we all read aloud what we could, or what we couldn't, in a frightful chorus, Biddy leading with a high, shrill, monotonous voice, and none of us having the least notion of or reverence for what we were reading about. When this horrible din had lasted a certain time, it mechanically awoke Mr. Wopsle's great aunt, who staggered at a boy fortuitously and pulled his ears. This was understood to terminate the course for the evening, and we emerged into the air with shrieks of intellectual victory. It is fair to remark that there was no prohibition against any pupil's entertaining himself with the slate, or even with the ink, when there was any, but that it was not easy to pursue that branch of study in the winter season, on account of the little general shop in which the classes were holden, and which also was Mr. Wopple's great aunt's sitting room and bedchamber, being but faintly illuminated through the agency of one low-spirited dip-candle and no snuffers. It appeared to me that it would take time to become uncommon. Under these circumstances, nevertheless, I tried to resolve it, and that very evening Biddy entered on our special agreement by imparting some information from her little catalogue of prices under the head of moist sugar, and lending me, to copy at home, a large old English D, which she had imitated from the heading of some newspaper, and which I supposed, until she told me what it was, to be a design for Buckle. Of course there was a public house in the village, and of course Joe liked sometimes to smoke his pipe there. I had received strict orders from my sister to call for him at the Three Jolly Bargemen that evening on my way from school, and bring him home at my peril. To the Three Jolly Bargemen, therefore, I directed my steps. There was a bar at the Jolly Bargemen, with some alarmingly long chalk scores in it on the wall at the side of the door, which seemed to me to be never paid off. They had been there ever since I could remember, and had grown more than I had. but there was a quantity of chalk about our country, and perhaps the people neglected no opportunity of turning it to account. It being Saturday night, I found the landlord looking rather grimly at these records, but as my business was with Joe and not with him, I merely wished him good evening and passed into the common room at the end of the passage, where there was a bright, large kitchen fire, and where Joe was smoking his pipe in company with Mr. Wopsle and a stranger. Joe greeted me as usual with, "Halloo, Pip, old chap," and the moment he said that, the stranger turned his head and looked at me. He was a secret-looking man whom I had never seen before. His head was all on one side, and one of his eyes was half shut up, as if he were taking aim at something with an invisible gun. He had a pipe in his mouth, and he took it out, and after slowly blowing all his smoke away and looking hard at me all the time, nodded. So I nodded, and then he nodded again, and made room on the settle beside him that I might sit down there. But as I was used to sit beside Joe whenever I entered that place of resort, I said, "No, thank you, sir," and fell into the space Joe made for me on the opposite set. The strange man, after glancing at Joe and seeing that his attention was otherwise engaged, nodded to me again when I had taken my seat, and then rubbed his leg in a very odd way as it struck me. "Who was saying," said the strange man, turning to Joe, "that you was a blacksmith?" "Yes, I said it, said Joe. "What'll you drink, mister? You didn't mention your name, by the by." Joe mentioned it now, and the strange man called him by it. "What'll you drink, Mr. Gargery, at my expense, to top up with?" "Well," said Joe, "to tell you the truth, I ain't much in the habit of drinking at anybody's expense but my own." "Habit? No," returned the stranger, "but once in a way, and on a Saturday night, too. Come, put a name to it, Mr. Gargery." "I wouldn't wish to be stiff company," said Joe. "Rum." "Rum," repeated the stranger. "And will the other gentleman originate a sentiment?" "Rum," said Mr. Wopsle. "Three rums," cried the stranger, calling to the landlord. "Glasses round." "This other gentleman," observed Joe, by way of introducing Mr. Wopsle, "is a gentleman that you would like to hear give it out, our clerk at church." "Aha," said the stranger quickly, and cocking his eye at me. "The lonely church, right out in the marshes, with graves round it." "That's it," said Joe. The stranger, with a comfortable kind of grunt over his pipe, put his legs up on the settee that he had to himself. He wore a flapping, broad-brimmed traveler's hat, and under it a handkerchief tied over his head in the manner of a cap, so that he showed no hair. As he looked at the fire, I thought I saw a cunning expression, followed by a half-laugh, come into his face. "I am not acquainted with this country, gentlemen, but it seems a solitary country towards the river." "Most marshes is solitary," said Joe. "No doubt, no doubt. Do you find any gypsies now, or trams, or vagrants of any sort out there?" "No," said Joe. "None but a runaway convict now and then, and we don't find them easy. Eh, Mr. Wopsle?" Mr. Wopsle, with a majestic remembrance of old discomfiture, assented, but not warmly. "Seems you've been out after such?" asked the stranger. "Once," returned Joe. "Not that we wanted to take them, you understand. We went out as lookers-on, me and Mr. Wopsle, and Pip. Didn't us, Pip?" "Yes, Joe." The stranger looked at me again, still cocking his eye, as if he were expressly taking aim at me with his invisible gun, and said, "He's a likely young parcel of bones, that. What is it you call him?" "Pip," said Joe. "Christened Pip?" "No, not christened Pip." "Surname Pip?" No, said Joe. It's a kind of a family name, what he gave himself when an infant, and it's called by. Son of yours. Well, said Joe meditatively. Not, of course, that it could be in any wise necessary to consider about it, but because it was the way at the Jolly Bargemen to seem to consider deeply about everything that was discussed over pipes. Well, no. No, he ain't. Nevy, said the strange man. Well, said Joe, with the same appearance of profound cogitation, he is not, no, not to deceive you, he is not my nevy. What the blazes is he? Asked the stranger, which appeared to me to be an inquiry of unnecessary strength. Mr. Wopsle struck in upon that, as one who knew all about relationships, having professional occasion to bear in mind what female relations a man might not marry, and expounded the ties between me and Joe. Having his hand in, Mr. Wopsle finished off with a most terrifically snarling passage from Richard III, and seemed to think he had done quite enough to account for it, when he added, as the poet says. And here I may remark that when Mr. Wopsle referred to me, he considered it a necessary part of such reference to rumple my hair and poke it into my eyes. I cannot conceive why everybody of his standing who visited our house should always have put me through the same inflammatory process under similar circumstances. Yet I do not call to mind that I was ever in my earlier youth the subject of remark in our social family circle. But such a large-handed person took such ophthalmic steps to patronize me. All this while the strange man looked at nobody but me, and looked at me as if he were determined to have a shot at me at last, and bring me down. But he said nothing after offering his blue blazes observation until the glasses of rum and water were brought, and then he made his shot. And a most extraordinary shot it was. It was not a verbal remark, but a proceeding in dumb show, and was pointedly addressed to me. He stirred his rum and water pointedly at me, and he tasted his rum and water pointedly at me, and he stirred it and he tasted it not with a spoon that was brought to him, but with a file. He did this so that nobody but I saw the file, and when he had done, he wiped the file and put it into breast pocket. I knew it to be Joe's file, and I knew that he knew my convict the moment I saw the instrument. I sat gazing at him spellbound, but he now reclined on his settle, taking very little notice of me, and talking principally about turnips. There was a delicious sense of cleaning up and making a quiet pause before going on in life afresh in our village on Saturday nights, which stimulated Joe to dare to stay out half an hour longer on Saturdays and at other times. The half hour and the rum and water running out together, Joe got up to go, and took me by the hand. Stop half a moment, Mr. Gargery, said the strange man. I think I've got a bright new shilling somewhere in my pocket, and if I have, the boy shall have it. He looked it out from a handful of small change, folded it in some crumpled paper, and gave it to me. Yours, said he. Mind, your own. I thanked him, staring at him far beyond the bounds of good manners, and holding tight to Joe. He gave Joe good night, and he gave Mr. Wopsle good night, who went out with us, and he gave me only a look with his aiming eye. No, not a look, for he shut it up, but wonders may be done with an eye by hiding it. On the way home, if I had been in a humor for talking, the talk must have been all on my side, for Mr. Wopsle parted from us at the door of the Jolly Bargemen, and Joe went all the way home with his mouth wide open to rinse the rum out with as much air as possible. But I was in a manner stupefied by this turning up of my old misdeed and old acquaintance, and could think of nothing else. My sister was not in a very bad temper when we presented ourselves in the kitchen, and Joe was encouraged by that unusual circumstance to tell her about the bright shilling. A bad un, I'll be bound, said Mrs. Joe triumphantly, or you wouldn't have given it to the boy. Let's look at it. I took it out of the paper, and it proved to be a good one. But what's this? Said Mrs. Joe, throwing down the shilling and catching up the paper. 2 1-pound notes? Nothing less than 2 fat, sweltering 1-pound notes that seemed to have been on terms of the warmest intimacy with all the cattle markets in the county. Joe caught up his hat again and ran with them to the Jolly Bargeman to restore them to their owner. While he was gone, I sat down on my usual stool and looked vacantly at my sister, feeling pretty sure that the man would not be there. Presently Joe came back, saying that the man was gone, but that he, Joe, had left word at the Three Jolly Bargemen concerning the notes. Then my sister sealed them up in a piece of paper and put them under some dried rose leaves in an ornamental teapot on the top of a press in the state parlor. There they remained, a nightmare to me, many and many a night and day. I had sadly broken sleep when I got to bed, through thinking of the strange man taking aim at me with his invisible gun, and of the guiltily coarse and common thing it was to be on secret terms of conspiracy with convicts, a feature in my low career that I had previously forgotten. I was haunted by the file, too. A dread possessed me that when I least expected it, the file would reappear. I coaxed myself to sleep by thinking of Miss Havisham's next Wednesday, and in my sleep I saw the file coming at me out of a door without seeing who held it, and I screamed myself awake.